Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first ever Red Tractor webinar. I'm Jim Mosley, and I started as the CEO of Red Tractor just over a year ago. Just a little bit of information about myself. I've spent my whole entire career in the food and drink business. I started my career with a company called FMC, who if there's any older livestock farmers on the line, then you may recognize FMC, was once owned by the National Farmers Union and was indeed Europe's largest meat manufacturer. And I started actually on the killing line at Sheffield Corporation Abattoir, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. And then I've worked for a variety of food businesses, including Ovaltine, Tulip, and General Mills, who you'd probably know better as the brands like Old El Paso, Haagen-Dazs, Green Giant, Just Roll, Nature Valley, and many others. Now, assuming that this technology works well and you find it a useful way of finding out more about Red Tractor, then we will definitely follow up with more webinars on different subjects. Tonight's topic, though, is around the Red Tractor consumer campaign, which is currently on air and broke about 4 weeks ago. We'll tell you a little about why we made it, how we made it, who it's aimed at, and indeed how we'll measure it. And the way that we'll run this evening is we'll start with a slide presentation that will include the TV adverts, and that should last about 25 minutes, and then we'll answer questions at the end. Now, you're all muted through the webinar, but on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a box where you can type questions. And please do this as we go along, and then I will do my best to answer them at the end. And similarly, if you have any technical difficulties, then again, please type the problem into the same questions box and we'll try and address them. The aim is to try and finish at about 8:15 if we can. So I'm going to start by presenting Red Tractor's vision. Now, this vision is best described as something that we, Red Tractor, are striving to get to. And that vision is to be the flagship for British food and farming, with world-class standards, independent inspection, and robust compliance at its core. And let me just explain some of the key words that are in that vision. So why a flagship? Well, I think that if we were all sat in a room trying to either sell British agriculture to more UK consumers or indeed to an export buyer, then it would be the safety, the traceability, and the responsibility with which we produce food to Red Tractor standard that would be the key selling points. So all of that is underpinned by Red Tractor. And because Red Tractor is also consumer facing with its logo, that's why we believe it is uniquely placed to communicate that. Why world-class standards? Well, at the moment, I can tell you that the Red Tractor scheme, both its standards and the way it's managed, is indeed world-class. And we have that verified by lots of independent research. But world-class actually, I believe, gives British agriculture a competitive advantage. And therefore, I think we need to maintain those world-class standards. And finally, robust compliance. And that for me is absolutely critical because it is there to protect the integrity of Red Tractor. And I think we probably all know how easily that can be damaged if we find there's a weak link in the chain or something that lets down the scheme, and therefore consumers are not going to trust it as much as we want them to. So that's our vision, that's our starting point, and indeed the starting point for the developing of the campaign. But having developed this vision, we have then done an enormous amount of shopper research into what's important when they buy food and so on. Now, like all of you, I know that when we ask a shopper what's important when you buy food, they will all answer price and quality. But as you question them a little further about what they mean by quality, apart from the way the product eats, they'll typically tell you the following. Their overarching concerns are with food safety and with traceability. And with traceability, what consumers will say is that where you can tell me where that food has come from, you are taking a degree of accountability for it, which in my view means that I will trust it. And so safety and traceability are both right at the top of that pile. After that, and of course where appropriate, comes animal welfare. And then very close behind, and I would also say gaining in importance, is environmental protection and indeed ethics and fair trade. And by ethics, we probably mean worker welfare, their rights, the fact that their health and safety is protected, and so on. Now, for all the farmers on this webinar, I'm sure that you will recognize that hierarchy within the Red Tractor standards. And it's exactly how we develop our standards in line with those consumer concerns. So if that's what consumers are concerned about, then who gives them the comfort that that's done properly? And many would say, well, British does that. And British has got a great reputation with UK consumers. You can see on this slide some of the words that consumers will play back to us when we ask them about the importance of British. They know it's fresh, they know that it's high quality and safe, they know the ethics generally are well looked after, and so on. So many people will say, doesn't British alone do the job for British agriculture? Well, the difficulty is that when you push consumers a little further and say, well, are there other markets that you would trust as well? They actually will say, well, over a third of primary shoppers in the UK would say that the US standards are equal to or indeed better than the UK. 3/4 of the population thinks New Zealand standards are the same or better than the UK. So our concern is that British alone will not actually do the job. And therefore the combination of British and Red Tractor with its standards is a much, much stronger combination. So with that in mind, as we started to develop our campaign, our objective was very clearly to increase the shopper's understanding of what Red Tractor does. So today, as we go out and do our research, around 69% of the shoppers say that they recognize the logo, and 58 say that it positively influences their purchasing decisions. But it has to be said that when you talk to these shoppers, although they recognize the logo and although they know it stands for something good, other than that, they know very little about the scheme, which I think is a great pity, because given the amount of work and effort that farmers go to achieve those standards, it would be far better if shoppers knew that. And we know that when shoppers do understand more detail behind Red Tractor, they are twice as likely to look for that logo in store. And it was that statistic that really said we need to increase the shopper understanding of what Red Tractor is. And there is no better way than doing that than developing a campaign all around that. So we have invested something like £1.5 million in the campaign, and we launched with a TV advert on the 12th of September. But in addition to TV, there's only so much you can do with a TV advert. There is also an element of print and digital and social and PR behind this campaign. It is also supported by most of the retailers. So when we tell the retailers that we're doing some activity, they will then build on that and build on the activity themselves, which amplifies our message. So if we go a stage further and say, who is our absolute core consumer audience? And remember here, when we talk about Red Tractor, we're talking about every element of agriculture that fits in it, from all the livestock brands, poultry, fresh produce, combinable crops, etc. And so at that level, we sort of narrow down on our core consumer as being a lady, perhaps Kelly, who's probably in her very early 40s. She's married, probably got 3 children. And you can see on the slide the sorts of things, the sorts of media that she reads or looks at, where she shops, the typical brands that sit within her basket, and so on. And that is our absolute core audience for British agriculture at its widest sense. Now, as our campaign develops and we start to then tackle specific issues, then of course we can narrow that audience further still and be very specific with our messaging depending on what the issue is. In terms of the actual campaign, These are some of the programs that our advert has been running in. We started in the very first day on the Wednesday, the 12th, with Emmerdale, but you can see a whole variety of programs that are absolutely aimed at that core consumer. So that 42-year-old female with children who will be the primary shopper in the family. So with that, let me then show you the adverts. I'm going to show first a 30-second advert, which is the main one that we've been running. There is also then following that a 10-second cut down, and we'll show those adverts now.
Behind our red tractor is peace of mind when putting food upon your table. UK farmed, meticulously checked. Just look for the red tractor label. There are thousands of checks, thorough, widespread, from crop stores to chicken sheds, cows and sows and what they're fed, fruits, roots, vegetable beds. So from field to basket, it feels fantastic to know we're always there to ensure your food is traceable, safe and farmed with care. Just look for the red tractor.
So that's the 30-second advert, which is doing the bulk of the work in this first part of the campaign. We also, though, do have a 10-second cut down of the advert, which is there to kind of reinforce the message and also call people to action.
Behind our red tractor is peace of mind when putting food upon your table. Traceable, safe and farmed with care. Just look for the red tractor label.
Now, I'm sure that some of you in the audience will be wondering why we've chosen animation for the advert rather than featuring real farmers. I won't make any jokes about trying to find attractive farmers that could go on TV, but I think that one of the reasons that we have gone with animation is to get what I describe as cut through or attention amongst all the advertising that is out there. And certainly when you come to look at food and farming type of messages, particularly in store, nearly everyone features a handsome kind of rugged farmer, you know, up against his crops or his animals or against a tractor and so on. And I think therefore we didn't want to be in that same genre, as it were, which is one of the reasons why we've gone for an animated campaign. The second is, of course, that we're appealing to mothers and potentially mothers with children. And again, I think this has some more child appeal than just a typical farmer related advert. So those are the main reasons that we've gone with animation. The company then that made the advert is also the same agency that have made other films such as The Fantastic Mr. Fox. And I've got just a very short, if you like, director's cut of how this advert was actually made and the diligence that went into it, which I think could be interesting.
So this is actually the first consumer-facing ad that the Red Tractor have ever done, where they've actually put a stake in the ground and said, this is who we are, this is what we stand for. When we started looking into Red Tractor, it was very obvious that, you know, they do an awful lot. So quite simply, we wanted to show that behind this Red Tractor, there's a lot that goes on.
They're there at every step just to make sure that certain standards are met. And that's important. It's something that we try to convey in the ad.
The care and attention we put into this ad, we hope comes across and mirrors the care and attention that Red Tractor put into what they do as well.
So that's just a little around the making of the advert. Now, obviously, there is only so much message and information that you can get across in a 30-second advert. So in order to better explain what Red Tractor does, we need to find mediums where we have more time to be able to talk to our consumers. So in addition to the TV, we will also run a print campaign. Here's a good example with Good Housekeeping, where we've taken a double-page advertorial in this month's edition, which shows actually the path a carrot takes from farm right through to table and where Red Tractor can play a role in all of that. But also in partnering with someone like Good Housekeeping, we're then able to use them to amplify our own message. So here's a couple of examples of Facebook posts that they've used to that incorporate Red Tractor and talk about moving to a more British type of diet and buying British ingredients. And similarly, on the right side of this chart is a social infographic. Now, this is something that that Good Housekeeping will do to explain a little bit about terminology that we see in food and on packaging and so on. But you can see the way that together with Red Tractor, we have then customized that message to incorporate all the Red Tractor messages. So hopefully that gives you a good example of how we can partner with people, particularly in print, to amplify the message. And then on this slide, there are some examples of the digital advertising that we will do. And in the red boxes at the bottom, you can see just approximately how many ads or ad impressions or people that will have seen our advertising through the digital channels. So given that that is the campaign, I guess one of the questions will be, well, how do we know that that campaign will be successful and how will it work? So there are some key performance indicators that we will use to check that. For example, we have done a dip before the campaign started in terms of how aware are consumers of the logo and what it means. How does it affect people's purchasing and what they understand by Red Tractor? And then we will do that post-dip in early November when our campaign is, or the first activity in our campaign is complete. And we will be able to compare the scores. And clearly we would be hoping that the awareness and the purchase influence, etc., will have gone up. But there are also some other measures that we can use. So, for example, the involvement of both our licensees and our retailers and other stakeholders. So how are they embracing Red Tractor and indeed amplifying our message and using us much more in order to sell their own products? And we can see a lot of activity with both our licensees and our retailers who are taking our assets and then using that to further endorse their own brands or their own menus or their own products and amplify the campaign. And on that last area of investment, so one thing that's probably pretty important to say is that the farmers have not paid for this campaign or those adverts. It is actually the licensees that are paying, and we've put up our license fees to them in order to use that money to market and develop this campaign. And therefore we need to be able to be sure that, one, we are paying back our licensees by demonstrating that more people will look for and buy Red Tractor. And therefore, if I can get that, if you like, that cycle running, then we can look at developing more licensee investment, more use of the logo by retailers and other stakeholders that will give me more investment that I can continue to spend behind the Red Tractor mark in order to increase that understanding. So is it good for farmers? Well, for me, it absolutely is. If nothing else, whenever I meet and talk to a farmer, almost every one of them will say to me, well, you don't do enough about telling consumers what Red Tractor does. And hopefully you'll see that we've addressed that and we are doing precisely that. So my hope would be that it would certainly increase the demand for Red Tractor products. It's also informing consumers of the high standards that farmers operate to. Again, I think it's frustrating in some respects that we achieve such good standards in the UK, and yet nobody seems to be able to realise or recognise that. But hopefully this campaign will address that too. Similarly, I also think that there are some good export opportunities for Red Tractor, and this, I think, starts that idea of it becoming a much more consumer-facing brand, which it potentially could be in some of the export markets. And what do I need from farmers? What can you do to support it? Well, I have a short slogan here: every member, every standard, every day. And that talks a lot to that issue of robust compliance. So if I know that every one of our farmer members is complying with every one of Red Tractor standards every day of the year, then there won't be any weak links within that chain. So it's really important that the farmers embrace that and comply with all of those standards. And does it stop there? No, it absolutely doesn't. This is the very first campaign that we've run, but clearly the intention is to continue with that activity, and if I can secure more licensee funds, to actually increase the amount of consumer activity. And the objective all the time will be to continue to develop that consumer understanding and the value of Red Tractor, and we'll continue to do that through TV and print and digital, social and PR. I also think it's really important to do that, particularly given all of the uncertainties of Brexit. So when you hear about chlorinated chicken or growth promoted beef, whatever it may be, I actually think that that is an opportunity for us to talk even more about Red Tractor and its standards and what the difference is between Red Tractor food and potentially some of the imports that we might see. So for me, in fact, 2019 is probably going to be even more important than this year to be getting across those messages. So with that, I will leave the slide presentation. I can see on my right-hand box that we have an enormous number of questions. So I'm going to try and do my best to start addressing some of those questions. Let me run through. So I have a question about world-class standards and whether that suggests that are we being a bit elite? You know, there's nothing wrong with that, but could all of you can that be right for all of UK food and farming? Well, to answer that, I would simply say that right now, if we take the Red Tractor scheme, both its standards and the way we manage that scheme, it is already world-class. Now, there are some very good schemes out around the globe. Some farmers, and particularly if you're in fresh produce or combinable crops, you may know more about the Global Gap scheme. So we are equivalent with Global Gap, and any UK farmer that is Red Tractor assured can export to export markets simply by registering with Global Gap and doing nothing more. There's nothing more that you need to do to be able to export to those markets, because we are recognized by Global Gap. A number of other schemes around the globe tend to be what I describe as slightly single issue. So they may look very closely at sustainability or animal welfare or something. Very few, if any, of the schemes have the breadth that Red Tractor has, that it covers both welfare, safety, environmental protection and ethics. So for me, we are already world class, and maintaining that world class, I think, keeps a competitive advantage for British agriculture, which will be key to protecting or indeed promoting our share of the UK market, and indeed trying to open up some export markets as well. A second question that we've got is around whether the vision for ethical and fair trade is ensuring everyone in the supply chain gets treated fairly. I think, and I can see another question that also talks about the fact that Red Tractor is not just farm standard, it's whole chain food assurance. And that the answer to that question is absolutely right. We are whole chain, but in the 30-second advert, we have already a lot to say about Red Tractor and the farm standards, and therefore felt that the messaging that we did in our advert was better to start with that and allow the print, the social media, the digital to be able to talk about the fact that we are whole chain. So the Good Housekeeping piece, for example, will show very clearly that we are a whole chain scheme. So where we have a little more time to have those conversations with the consumer, of course we can talk about the extent of our scheme completely. And in terms of the question around the ethics and so on, clearly that also has to be whole chain. And I think a lot of consumers these days need to ensure that worker welfare, their rights, their health and safety, even their pay and so on, is being protected. So I don't think any consumer is happy with any exploitation of employees or workers anywhere within the food chain. So that point about should that be whole chain and it applies equally is absolutely right. Let's look at some others. So there's a question about hospitality and whether or not Red Tractor could play a role within the food service market. And I think actually well, first of all, we already do play within the food service market in the sense that there are a number of very big players, the Bidvests of this world and so on, who are Red Tractor licensees and who will insist on certainly a lot of their product being Red Tractor branded. So if, like me, you want a really cheap roast and you go to the Toby Carvery, you'll see that Red Tractor features on their menu, as it does in Nando's or KFC or even IKEA and so on. So we are already within that market, and certainly that market is, for me, the out-of-home market is equally as important as retail, and we will continue to develop that. Okay, so how do we engage with schools? So I think in that we do a lot of work with Agricultural Horticulture Development Board and the NFU. So any materials that go into schools typically include information on Red Tractor. So I think that's probably the answer to that. Let me scroll down for some more. How can we make the Red Tractor logo on food bigger? It's too small, so consumers don't always notice it. And I would say to that question, you're absolutely right, particularly for the older consumer. We are always, of course, trying to get the maximum visibility for the Red Tractor logo. And to be fair, I think that, interestingly, one of the major retailers we work with, Morrison's, has actually done a repackaging exercise on a lot of their meat fixture, and actually the logo is indeed bigger than it used to be. But for me, the simple answer to this is the more education we can give to consumers, therefore the more likely they are to look for Red Tractor, the more I can tell the retailers, the food service operators and so on, that actually this logo needs to be bigger because it can add value to your brand and your menu. And so for me, this is a little bit of a chicken and egg situation. We need to be able to develop that understanding and that value in the mark or the brand for them, therefore, to run that brand bigger and bolder on their packaging. The same is absolutely true for those retailers or food service operators who don't use the logo, or perhaps who don't use the logo on everything that they could. It'll always be about adding value to their brand. In some instances, I use an example of Intel. So if any of you farmers and growers or participants out there who are watching this on a laptop, it may well be that that laptop has an Intel processor in it. And in some respects, I see Red Tractor very similarly, that it is the intelligence, it is the standards that go into that food product. Now, you'll know how well known the Intel brand is. Our job is to make Red Tractor equally as well known on the food products that it sits on. I've got a few questions about okay, we've got some questions about organic and higher welfare. As lots of you may know, we made an announcement on that, but what I would like to do is I have a few questions on that, and I personally think that that should be the subject of a completely separate webinar. So we will capture all of those questions, and we will run a future webinar that talks exactly about the longer term future plans of Red Tractor. So fear not, they will be answered, but it would be much better for me to be prepared with some materials that can answer that more fully. Let me scroll to see if there's anything else that we haven't collected. Okay, yes, so another question about why the ad is centered on farm standards and not processing, and the question actually mentions some incidents that we've had more recently in processing, and indeed the horse meat scandal, which happened quite some time before I joined Red Tractor. I can say that on the horse meat scandal, actually Red Tractor was in a perfect position, because not a single Red Tractor product was actually implicated in that whole horse gate issue. However, we're absolutely right. We have had more incidents within the processing sector that, again, we can weaken the credibility. And therefore, I think, what are we doing about that? Now, lots of people, I think, will have seen that we're trying to strengthen our inspection regime. We will be introducing more unannounced audits. Everyone who is in the meat processing area has got to sign up to unannounced audits by Red Tractor as a part of the inspection. So there are lots of measures that we are putting in place to strengthen the whole regime, not just on farm, but through processing as well. So it's a good question, and that is happening. Then we have a question about whether we're influenced by lobbying groups, and people who are at the, perhaps sometimes at the extreme end, particularly around perhaps animal welfare. Let me say that when we develop a standard, our standard is developed using lots and lots of different inputs. So we look at science and evidence. We look at where there is best practice around the globe. We look at what the market is demanding, so the consumer is demanding, or indeed the customer, the retailer, or the food service operator. So we take all of those inputs, but at the same time, we look at what the farmer and the grower can reasonably and practically do. So, can we move the farmer to for instance, in poultry, we're looking at putting windows in all of our chicken houses, and we know how difficult that will be for certain farmers. But the science, the evidence, the drive from the marketplace is there, and therefore we've had to make that kind of balance, that compromise, to develop that standard. And that's the way we will always develop the standard. It's trying to deliver what the market needs on a timely basis that allows the farmer to be invested in a new system or new methods or a new process and continue to fulfill that demand. And that's the way we've developed our standards over the last 18 years or so. So are we influenced by the activists? Well, the way that we're influenced, I suppose, is that if the activist certainly has an impact on the consumer, and we see that consumer demand coming through, then clearly we may need to react to that in the marketplace. But typically, we are driven much more by science and evidence when we develop the standards. A question a little about the inspection regime. So one thing that we will have announced recently is our intent to strengthen the inspection regime. And I mentioned the unannounced audit. So what we're doing here is that we will apply what we call a risk-based approach to inspection in the future. And by that, I mean that we have an enormous amount of data on all of the farmers and growers that we operate with, and we can see exactly the results of every annual inspection that we do with those farmers. And let me also say that the vast majority do a really, really good job. But I think it's also fair to say that there is a small minority of farmers that are problematic, that always have non-conformances when we do our annual inspection. So the way we will operate in the future is to actually say that when you have your annual inspection, depending on the nature and the number of non-conformances that you have, one, you have to clearly close those non-conformances out. But number two, you may well get a increased inspection frequency, and those new inspections will be totally unannounced. And our aim with that, therefore, is to support those farmers to bring them up to those Red Tractor standards. And I've got a question here that says, for single operator farms, unannounced inspections will create problems. I completely and utterly understand the practicalities of doing unannounced audits on very small farms where you may well be a single operator. So there are lots of things that we will do to try to offset those impracticalities. So we will check, is there always a day or 2 days in the week when you won't be on the farm? Is there a contact that we can get that means that actually when we do it, we can make contact with someone, etc., etc. I won't go into all of the details, but there's probably a checklist of maybe 9 or 10 things that we will do to try to overcome the difficulty of doing an unannounced audit on a single operator farm, because I completely understand the issue. A good one there. Should you consider doing a TV program with a broadcaster to inform the difference in standards between us and I won't say the country that's mentioned, just in case that upsets people, but other countries? And well, first, as I said, I think we have the opportunity with our campaign to be able to tailor it to answer those very specific questions. So yes, if somebody says, could Australian beef or Argentinian beef come into the country when they are typically reared through a growth promoter and a feedlot system, which may be different to the way that we produce in the UK? And I would say that our campaign has the opportunity to address exactly those differences and those concerns. Now, whether we do it ourselves or whether we use a kind of an individual who would be a really good spokesperson, I think we need to decide, you know, on how we do that. But whichever way we go, it is definitely the opportunity for Red Tractor to talk to our consumers about those differences and why, if they have got any concerns, they should always trust Red Tractor. Sorry, where did it go, Richard? So there's a question coming through. Okay, there is a question that's coming through about lifetime assurance. Now, I'm hoping that everyone on the call probably knows what that refers to. It's talking about the fact that at the moment, for cattle, they only need to be on a Red Tractor unit for 90 days to be called assured. And in our world, that's not good enough, because if we are looking consumers in the eye and saying we are looking after the health and welfare of that animal for its whole life, then we need to know and be sure that indeed it has been well treated, etc., for its whole life. So our intent will still be to get to what we describe as whole life assurance for cattle and for sheep. It's going to take a while to get there because there are some things that we need to do to be able to deliver that. And one of them will be what is called the Livestock Information Program, which is a new database that is being driven by a combination of both DEFRA and industry that will give us much better data about the movement of animals. And once that livestock information program is up and running, it takes away some of the difficulty of achieving lifetime at the moment. So we will have that data and it'll be much easier to track movements. And when we have that and we have sufficient time to be able to transition to whole life without causing unnecessary shortages in the market, then we will certainly get to lifetime assurance. So that is without question an intent that we need to achieve. Okay, so I can't see any other additional questions. There are no more questions, but one thing that we would like is to get any feedback or any particular subjects that you would like us to explain and be able to talk through. So I think from looking at the bulk of questions, we would definitely do one on the inspection regime and unannounced audits and inspections, because that's come up. We clearly need to do one on what we describe as complete assurance, which is this development of the modular approach to standards. So I can see at least 2 webinars that we will do to cover those 2 subjects. But if in your question box you can drop in both any feedback that you have for us and any subjects that you would like us to cover in future webinars, that would be really appreciated. I see also that a quick poll has come up, which by all means, if you can fill in to see whether you found it informative, that would be good. Fortunately, there's no poll about the actual presenter. Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for your attendance this evening. We will collect all of that feedback. We will collect those subjects that you want us to talk about at a future webinar, and please look out for future webinar invitations. Thank you very much indeed.